Okay, so we're just going to get started. All right, so welcome everyone to the session on long-term restoration results and lessons learned in New York, New Jersey Harbor. And I just want to mention a few housekeeping rules about the chat. Make sure that you put any comments, discussion, observations in the chat box, as well as post any questions in the Q&A area for Judith, my co-moderator at the end, as well as taking advantage of the community board to continue the conversation as we move forward. So my name is Lisa Barron. I am a project manager and manage the restoration program at the New York District at the Corps of Engineers. And I'm the co-chair of the HEP Restoration Work Group. And I just want to thank everyone for participating in the conference, as well as showing up to this panel and participating in this session. And so I know that everybody who is involved here is working on restoring the estuary in one way or another and is passionate about whether it's the entire estuary or your favorite river, as we've got representatives really working hard, tirelessly to move it forward. But I think we all know that, that this area is the most urbanized region in the United States, one of them, as well as having lost significant amount of habitat, more than 85% of the wetlands lost, 99% of freshwater wetlands lost, or 100%, about 100% of the oysters, and then the habitat that remains is highly degraded. So I know that everyone who's participating in this conference has been working to change those statistics around. And as this particular panel is focused on the long-term restoration, so restoration has been going on for almost 40 years in some cases, and we're going to hear from our distinguished restoration practitioners, and as I think Isabel called them, the VIPs of the Restoration Work Group. And so really the people that have, we're just showcasing a few of the Restoration Work Group participants for advancing all of their restoration in a variety of areas within the estuary. So we're going to focus on the Hackensack Meadowlands with Terry Doss, the Jamaica Bay Marsh Islands with Patty Rafferty, Marit Larson, who is going to be talking about all the New York City wetlands and restoration projects, as well as Carl, who is our movie star, who is going to be talking about the harbor and all the work that NOAA's been doing. So I guess I just want to, one of the really important parts of this particular panel is how they've synthesized and really looked at their data from monitoring so that they can provide lessons learned for us. Because as we've talked about, there's a lot more that has to be done, a lot more restoration projects that are ongoing, that are coming into the future, especially with the influx of funds. And it's going to be very informative and critical so that we can have the best projects as we move forward with the state of the science. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the first speaker, Terry Doss, who serves as the co-director and chief restoration scientist for the Meadowlands Research and Restoration Institute of the New Jersey Sports and Exposition Authority. And Terry's got over 35 years of experience, worked with NOAA, lots of different consulting firms, and now has landed this position in the Meadowlands, advancing a lot of great restoration projects within the Hackensack Meadowlands. So Terry, take it away.
Thanks, Lisa, appreciate it. Okay. All right, we're good to go. And I was wondering if by distinguished you meant old, but anyway. But anyway, good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to open this session by focusing on the Meadowlands. Some of the oldest restored sites are located in the Meadowlands, both upland and wetland sites that were mitigated, enhanced, or created over 30 to 40 years ago. So we have this living ecological restoration laboratory that we study and collect data from every day. I work for the New Jersey Sports and Exposition Authority, which is a state agency. And we're the regional and planning and zoning agency for the 30 square mile district known that I call the Badass Meadowlands. I've been referring to the Meadowlands lately as the Badass Meadowlands because despite all the anthropogenic abuses thrown at them over the past centuries, they're still thriving. They're providing amazing habitat, and they provide these great natural experiences to these urban communities within this uber urban environment. So just a spectacular place. At NJSCA, we have a number of diverse mandates as part of our mission, but for my group, the Meadowlands Research and Restoration Institute, our primary mandate is to protect the delicate balance of nature. And it's not an easy job because over the years, the Meadowlands have been misunderstood and mistreated and much maligned. Throughout the early and mid to 1800s, there were significant efforts to drain and improve the Meadowlands. These efforts failed, and by the late 19th century, the Meadowlands were regarded as a nuisance and a source of disease, and as an area that should just be developed rather than kept in its natural state. Pretty much the story for most of our urban wetlands. And despite man's best efforts to control nature and solve the problem of the unproductive soils of the Meadowlands and underutilized land and the pestilence, and even though back in the 1960s, even the Fish and Wildlife Service wrote off the Meadowlands, there's still around 8,000 acres of marsh, waterways, and open space right here in the center of the New York metropolitan area. And over the past 30 years, we've been monitoring these areas to track exactly what's going on. This is a copy of my tracking sheet. And while I realize you can't really see it, I just wanted you to get the sense of how many sites we've been looking at in one way or another over the years. We use a lot of different technologies to track these changes over time, including LiDAR, hyperspectral images, drones, surface elevation tables, and even carbon monitors to determine how different habitats are sequestering or releasing carbon. We also monitor the wildlife, the fish and benthic organisms, the birds, diamondback terrapin, and starting next year, bats. And what we found overall is that conditions within the Meadowlands are improving. We have better air and water quality, more habitat diversity, more public access, and increased protections for the remaining open space and wetlands. And these results are a direct effect of closing landfills. All landfills in the Meadowlands are now closed, tighter air and water regulations, and improved land uses throughout the Meadowlands. But it's also due to the preservation, mitigation, enhancement, and restoration of thousands of acres of marsh and upland sites in the district. So this is my tracking sheet kind of pulled apart and put into semblance so you can kind of track what we've been doing over time. The work to restore habitats has been occurring since the early 1980s, and it's going to continue well into the future. The district is surrounded by infrastructure, which will always need to be maintained. So there'll always be impacts to the wetlands and other sensitive habitats. So there's always going to be this need for mitigation. But at the same time, we're looking to restore the wetlands and other sensitive habitats that have been degraded over time. As a result, we're continually trying to make sense of what's worked and what hasn't worked. The first preservation and restoration project in the Meadowlands was, in fact, at DeCourt Park, where our offices are. This whole entire area is slated to be a landfill. So everything you're looking at was slated to be filled with trash. But the state put a stop to this in 1982. And this month, we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of the park, which includes miles of public access trails in and around the Sawmill Wildlife Management Area. But the majority of the sites that have been restored were done so as mitigation for wetland impacts. The earliest site was in 1983 at the 12-acre Vince Lombardi Wetland Mitigation Site along the Hackensack River. This was followed by the 60-acre Eastern Brackish Marsh and 63-acre Western Brackish Marsh mitigation sites around 1985 that were built to mitigate for development impacts. These sites were designed by the late, great Ed Garbish, founder of Environmental Concern, and basically the godfather of marsh reconstruction. And so he's provided us with with these sites and a lot of important information about how these wetland and upland sites evolve over time. Quickly summarize some of the information. We've been studying 77 sites. Of those, 47 sites are directly overseen by NJSCA. There's 28 mitigation and restoration sites throughout the Meadowlands and 3 wetland mitigation banks. Most of these are private. So the total mitigation marshland is a little over 11,000 acres. This map and the sites that are listed are located in our 2022 master plan. So if you're interested in digging into that, that's where you can find that information. But back to these sites, we have a number of other sites too, such as those that are currently being studied for potential mitigation and restoration. We have sites that are just preserved and hopefully will be remediated very soon. We have other sites that are privately owned marshlands that we're hoping someday will be preserved and restored. And most importantly, we have these potential future landfill upland restoration sites. That's the only upland we have around our wetlands is primarily landfill, so they're really important to us. But back to the mitigation, enhancement, and restoration sites. They range in age from 1 to 40 years. There was a wetland mitigation site that was recently constructed along the Lowson Slope for some FAA wetland impacts. The sites also range in size from less than 1 acre to more than 200 acres, including the 208-acre Marsh Resources Bank, which was created back in 1999, and the 223-acre Kane Wetland Mitigation Bank, which was created in 2012. 6 of these sites are less than or around 1 acre. 7 of the sites are between 1 and 10 acres, and 8 are between 10 and 30 acres. So the majority of the sites are less than 30 acres. The remaining 10 sites are all between 30 and 223 acres. The vast majority of the sites are tidal brackish marsh, and the mitigation practice was focused primarily on removing invasive non-native Phragmites and replacing with native species. This is because when the meadowlands evolved from a freshwater swamp to a tidal brackish marsh due to all the anthropogenic forces over time, there was a lack of native coastal grass seed sources. So Phragmites became the ubiquitous plant throughout the brackish marsh areas. But some of the projects were focused on creating sandy high marsh habitat, others with creating waterfowl ponds, and a few of the projects included creating public access to waterfront areas. So basically, how's it going? I'd like to start with the good, which is basically to say that in a tidal brackish marsh, if you can get the hydrology right and you protect the plants, that you can have successful plant survival even in unconsolidated muck, but you really got to get the conditions right. And you have to really eradicate the invasives before restoration. This allows for more biodiversity and less invasive maintenance practices later on, and for long-term sustainability. If you don't get rid of those invasives right away and you don't get the hydrology right, it's never going to fix itself. You really have to understand the site conditions, and if there's permitting delays, that doesn't have to be a bad thing. This can result in a lot more research, which can help to enrich your design and ultimately the long-term restoration success. And the use of any natural materials and mimicking natural systems, that's really what gives you the most success in the long term, creating more biodiversity and sustainability. And also for tidal marsh systems, if you can use overwintered plants when you're moving towards your planting part of your project, that creates this very strongly rooted system right from the start. And the more good, as I already mentioned, the conditions are improving in the Meadowlands. Our landfills are closed, contaminated sites are being remediated, and our wildlife populations are just growing exponentially, and the biodiversity just continues to increase. But now to the bad. A lot of the sites have not been successful over time, and it's mainly due to a lack of understanding of site conditions or bad construction practices. You often told that you can plant at any time during the season, but if you stick to a tight planting window, you can really give the site a boost that's needed at the start and keep those invasives out. Use of water control structures just isn't working in the long term. And you don't only have to figure out what's going on your site, you have to know what's going on around the site. So if you try to just carve out a little piece and get rid of the Phragmites there and it's surrounded by Phragmites, it doesn't work, yet it's been done too many times. Thanks, Lisa. Also, in the Meadowlands, this heavy reliance on maximizing functional uplift in some of our earlier projects, these were related to the assessment method that was being used, just created not natural systems. We really need to look at the full ecological system from wetland to upland and restore for that full system, not just trying to get the most wetland acre credits. And last, the ugly, development pressures continue in the Meadowlands. It's a sad fact of life. And also highly engineered water management structures are really affecting the viability of our wetland and upland systems. Again, I can't emphasize enough, if you don't control the invasive species right from the start, it just doesn't work in the long term. And we also need to stop using herbicide to really garden our sites. The last thing I want to say is in the Meadowlands, the open water acreage and the mudflat acreage are just continuing to increase. And this is very concerning given rising sea levels. And what we have found is those mudflat areas that used to be vegetated, they had been a carbon sink and now they're a carbon source. But we still have these beautiful areas, even within this urban urban environment. So what we're trying to do is figure out how to preserve them and how to get rid of all the threats to their viability that continue. We've developed a few plans to help guide our efforts. We have a strategic plan, our EPA-approved wetland program plan. We have our own Meadowlands-wide specific wildlife action plan. We're also guided by the stressors on our habitats. Our restoration work needs to focus on understanding the causes of degradation and not just merely treating the symptoms. These stressors are fairly typical to what you expect in urban systems, but the Meadowlands also has a few unique stressors. The hydrology and chemistry of the sites have been completely changed. The wildlife needs sandy coastal habitat, and that's just not found too often in the Meadowlands. The infrastructure, as I mentioned, will require maintenance into the future, so we'll always have these mitigation impacts. And NJSEA has little to no regulatory control over what's going on out in the Meadowlands. And lastly, I'll mention that we're now a Superfund area, so we're not even sure what that means in the long term for ecological restoration. But a lot of our focus is looking at those areas that are off river that hopefully won't be affected by the Superfund program. We've set our restoration priorities and goals, and these are focused on a forward-looking strategy that are incorporating climate change and sea level rise. But we're also really focused in on assisting in the recovery of these habitats, moving away from managing and more towards creating viable, sustainable natural systems. We, as I mentioned, want to create more sandy coastal habitat. We're looking at biocontrol of invasive species. An important thing is to remember to, thanks Lisa, to incorporate stormwater, not treat it as a waste product, and really start to nourish the wetlands rather than the past practices of excavating wetlands. And last, we just need to stop issuing wetland fill permits for development. Our restoration sites spread across the Meadowlands, and you can see it goes far beyond just looking at tidal brackish marshes. For example, we're currently working with the town of Kearney to create parkland and wildlife habitat at the now closed Keegan landfill. This will be really important to a town that's been overburdened and has little waterfront access. So we're quite excited by this. And just to end, I want to say I get so much hope from working in the Meadowlands and see so much potential for ecological restoration. We just need to work fast while the political climate is good. And we need to keep telling anyone that will listen about the amazing potentials while we still can. And I'll just close by saying the Meadowlands don't need us. The badass Meadowlands will be here long after we're gone. All we can do while we're here is to try to assist with the recovery and try to stop the harms that keep getting thrown at it. And we need your help, we need partners, we need funding, but where else can our work be seen by so many, the millions of people that travel through the Meadowlands every day on the highways and the rail lines? So I'm ready, let's go. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Terry. Really appreciate it. All right. Our next speaker is Patty Rafferty from the National Park Service. She is the Resource Stewardship Division Manager at Gateway, and she joined MPS in 2004, and shortly thereafter, like, really worked hard on at least working with us, the Corps. We're grateful for her working on the Marsh Islands and monitoring the Marsh Islands that were constructed. And I know she's going to be presenting a lot of great data that's going to inform the next 5 Marsh Islands that we construct as part of the HRE project. So with that, Patty, take it away.
Okay, sorry, I was having trouble getting unmuted. Thanks very much. I appreciate this opportunity to share some of the information and the lessons that we've learned over the last 18 years with Marsh Island restoration in Jamaica Bay. So all of the sites that I'm going to talk about today occur within Gateway National Recreation Area, which is a unit of the National Park Service. Much of Jamaica Bay and all of the Marsh Islands within Jamaica Bay are part of the national park. And the sites that I'm going to specifically talk about, I've outlined here on this map. The first Marsh Island restoration project occurred in 2003 on Big Egg Marsh. In 2006 and 2007, the Outers East project restoration project was constructed. 2010, Outers West was restored. 2012 was the construction of the Yellow Bar Marsh restoration. In 2012 and 13, Blackwall and Rollers Bar were restored, and construction of the West Pond Living Shoreline was completed in 2021. And so in this table, I've tried to summarize some information about each of those projects that were just identified on the prior map. And so the projects range in size from 2 acres to 46 acres. And there were a number of sediment placement techniques that were used. At Big Egg, thin layer jet spray was used. For most of the project sites, sediment slurry was the method used to deliver sediments to the island sites. And for the West Pond Living Shoreline, sediments were trucked into the site for restoration construction. There were also a variety of planting methods that were used. In all of the sites, there was some level of planting using plugs of vegetation. And at all sites, there was also Spartina alterniflora was part of a planting palette. At some sites, there were areas that were designated for high marsh, and in those areas, Spartina patens and Disticulus baccata were incorporated into the planting palette. At some of the Marsh Island restoration sites, we did a method which we refer to as hummock transplants, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. And we also looked at using seeding as a way to revegetate the marsh platform. And there are a number of projects or project partners that were key to the implementation, both the planning and the construction. The Army Corps was a partner in planning and funding the majority of the projects that are going to be discussed here today. And for Elders East, it was a mitigation project for the harbor deepening. And the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey was a planning and funding partner for that. For Elders West, Yellow Bar, and the Rollers Bar and Blackwall projects, New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and New York City Department of Environmental Protection were funding partners on that. The West Pond Living Shoreline was a project that was spearheaded by the Jamaica Bay Rockaway Parks Conservancy with partners from the Billion Oyster Project, American Little Society, and Eco Watchers. And I'm not going to speak any more about the West Pond Living Shoreline, which was just completed last year, but I will give a plug for the next session where Brett Bronco is going to be speaking, and he'll be talking a little bit about that project during his talk. So sediment placement using thin layer deposition. This was the method that was used at Big Egg, and a swing ladder dredge was brought in and actually dredged sediments out of the adjacent tidal creek and sprayed them up onto the marsh surface. This was done in the fall of 2003. To be able to increase the elevation, there were these white stakes put out with markers to help guide the elevation that was desired for the placement of that material. So this thin layer deposition tends to work best in areas where you have a nearby source of sediment, deep deep enough water to get a dredge into there. Generally, it's used for thin layer application. Truth in Advertising at Big Egg, there was fairly deep sediment deposition put in some places up to 30 centimeters to a meter in depth, but often it's used in areas where you just want to supplement the elevation and you're just putting in maybe a few inches. And in cases like that, you can actually do it while still preserving the vegetation. At Big Egg, most of the vegetation did not survive because of the depth of placement. And it's particularly a good method where you're not in a sediment-starved environment or where you have that easy access to sediments. It also has some limitations in terms of how far you can spray back. At Big Egg, we were only able to achieve about 100 meters, but there have been a number of other projects that have been done in other areas where there are boosters and other things that have been utilized to be able to get a broader coverage back into a marsh. The sand slurry placement method was used for most of the marsh island restoration that's been done to date in Jamaica Bay. And you can see just off to the upper left of this top picture here, there's a dredge that brought in this material from outside of the bay. That material was then slurried and moved through a pipeline onto the marsh. You can see here, there's equipment here ready to work it. You can see the pipeline. There's a levee system that's generally was put in place to help contain and direct that sediment flow. Here you can see the sand slurry pipeline when it's not in work. Here's where it's delivering materials. And in each of these sand slurry projects, after the sediment came on site and had time to dewater, the sediments were then worked by equipment. So you need to be able to have a site where you can bring large equipment in. This is a method that brings sediments into a system. So it works well in sediment-starved systems, but you have to have that source of sediment to be able to bring to your project. It works well when you need to have a large increase in elevation change, when you're changing, moving from intertidal or subtidal habitat to try to increase the elevation for an emergent marsh platform, for example. It allows you to place sediments over a very large area because you're not constrained by the restriction of spray that we saw in the jet spray method. We also used a number of different planting techniques in Jamaica Bay. And so here you can see one of the methods that's very tried and true with most marsh restoration projects is using plugs of plant material that are nursery grown, that are brought on site, usually in these trays like this, and are planted. One of the great advantages of using planting plugs is that you can engage the community. If it's a site that's accessible, you can bring in volunteers or community organizations to help with the planting. And I can't underemphasize the value of having the public and volunteers and partner organizations being able to come out to a site to help to plant. But you do need to have a nursery source, and you do need to be able to transport plant material onto the site and be able to manage for having that plant material and getting it out to your site and getting it planted in a timely way to be able to have success. You can see in this photo here, you can see when the plugs are planted, it's very sparse vegetation, but this is that same location just a couple months after plugs were planted in the spring, in May and early June. And by late August, you can see that those plugs are taking off, and that's pretty typical. Another advantage of using potted material or plugs is that many contractors are really used to working with that. And you can often incorporate into, if you're having a contractor do the work, a plant warranty, where other methods where they're not as used to working with those methods may not get you the same kind of contractor warranties. When we were at Elders East, the first large marsh restoration that occurred, there was we came up with doing this hummock transplant as sort of an adaptive management during construction, because there were some areas where there was going to be some vegetation that couldn't be salvaged by filling around the vegetation, so it was excavated, and this then became the primary planting method for the Elders West restoration, and was also a planting method used at Yellow Bar. And For this method, where there was existing vegetation, which was largely existing as hummocks or as mounds of vegetation were somewhat disparate, where the marsh that had been between those vegetated areas had eroded away, the hummocks were excavated and moved by equipment to an area of the project site where they were then stored, while sediment was then brought in to raise the elevation. And then once the desired elevation was achieved, those hummocks were then brought back in with equipment and planted. And one of the advantages that we felt of doing that would be not only would we then be conserving the vegetation and be allowing then for vegetative propagation, so having the rhizomes provide lateral growth for revegetation between the hummocks, but also if you look really closely at this photo, you can see there's rib mussels and snails. So it would also help to conserve some of the benthic community, and we hope to give a jump start to that establishment of the benthic community in the restored marsh. Another method that was used was seeding. And so this is a seed drill here that is shown out at Yellow Bar Hassock during the restoration, and there were large areas of Yellow Bar Hassock. We also use this method at Blackwall. And so it's a great method in terms of being able to cover plant seed a large area in fairly quick time. You have to be able to have access to the seed drill and get it out there. You also have to have a seed source, but it can be a really cost-effective method. And I just showed here, this is the same vegetation monitoring plot, just to give you a visual of this was seeded in April of 2012. In October of 2012, we would have thought that there wasn't much success, but as you can see, this second photo is the same plot 2 years later, and then in 2014, and here's in 2016, we saw quite good succeeding success at the Yellow Bar Hassock. I'll talk a little bit later. We didn't see quite the same success at Blackwall, where we also tried seeding. At Elders West, we left about a 2-acre area, which you can see in this portion of this photo, that was not, we didn't do any type of planting. We didn't seed it, we didn't plant it. We just wanted to see if natural recruitment would be an effective method for revegetation of the marsh surface once we had increased the elevation and created a sediment platform. The thought was that throughout Jamaica Bay, both at the restored marshes and at the existing marshes, there's a lot of seed that is produced. We know that seed is viable because that seed has been collected and been used to propagate plants or to be used in the seeding. So we wanted to see if we could just let nature take its course and get revegetation. The only site that we tried this at, again, was about 2 acres at Elders West. And here is a vegetation plot, one of the sample plots, which is typical of all 30 plots from the Elders West non-planted area. We did not see revegetation at all from natural recruitment. So in Jamaica Bay, at least from this one trial, and based upon this one trial, we did not repeat it at any of the future restoration sites. I'm going to show you just a little bit of data with regard to the vegetation response. And this data is going to focus on the Elders West site, which was restored in 2010, the Yellow Bar site, which was restored in 2012, Blackwall and Rollers Bar 2012 to 13. And then I'm also going to be including data from Joko, which was the reference site. So Joko Marsh is the marsh that's been doing the best of any of the marsh islands in Jamaica Bay. And so we had an area of Joko Marsh where we collected data to be able to compare to the restored sites as a reference condition. One thing I want to point out while we're looking at this is that you can see especially for Elders West and for the Blackwall and Rollers Bar, there's a fair exposure from the southwest direction. Whereas Yellow Bar, only the northern portion of Yellow Bar was restored. The remainder of the marsh was not restored. And so you had this large area of marsh below the restoration site that provided protection from sort of the southwest fetch. So this graph shows us the mean total percent cover of live vegetation at these marshes. This is the Outers West Marsh. This is Yellow Bar, and this is Rollers Bar and Blackwall. The top line on each of these is for the JOCO reference marsh. So that's showing the total, at the average live coverage over these years, and the years differ, but these are all a total of 100%. So, and then the other, I'll walk you through what the rest of the graphs show. So this is sort of what we were considering the reference condition, what we would like to see our restored marshes achieve. So at Elders East, where we didn't plant, that's this purple line here, you can see we didn't get any vegetation. Or I'm sorry, this is Elders West. At Elders West, where we did hummock relocation, we got a fairly good response. Our goal was to get 50% coverage within the first 3 growing seasons. And you can see here that we didn't achieve the 50% coverage until the 5th full growing season. And at Elders West, where there was high marsh planting, we saw a fairly similar response to the hummock relocation method that was used for the Spartina alterniflora. And just for, again, truth in advertising, at the Elders, the high marsh area, we did have to come back in and replant that with some Spartina alterniflora, and it predominantly became a Spartina alterniflora that it did not quite achieve that elevation that supported the Distichus spicata and the Spartina patens. So if we look at, and this again, remember, this had a fairly high southwest exposure. If we look down here at Rollers Bar and Blackwall, Rollers Bar was planted with plugs, and we can see a fairly good response. And by the 4th growing season, we achieved more than that 50% live coverage. That was one of our goals. Our goal was that by the 3rd year, but we achieved that by the 4th year at the Rollers Bar, where it was planted with plugs. Where we seeded at Blackwall.
Patty?
Yes.
If you could wrap up, you've ran out of time.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Okay. So I'll close it there, and I apologize. I did not plan well enough, but I think one of the take homes there is that the exposure and hydrology is a really important factor with regard to seeing the vegetative response success.
Thanks so much, Patty. Really appreciate it. And I know all the data that you've monitored as we design Stony Creek right now and get ready for the next Marsh Island for construction in 2025 with New York City DEP. We're really excited about it. And so we thank you. And I guess we're going to turn it to the next speaker, Mart Larson, who is my co-chair of the Restoration Work Group and chief of the natural resources at New York City Parks. She's also my sponsor for a few of our projects that we're advancing with the Corps, but she's got more than 25 years of experience in managing all sorts of restoration projects, whether it's wetlands, forests, green infrastructure projects, and oversees the team that's managing and monitoring over 10,000 acres of natural area in New York City. Take it away, Mart.
Thank you. I'll try to share the right screen. Am I sharing the screen now?
No.
Nope.
No. Okay.
Yeah.
That's right. How about there?
Nope.
Nope.
No. Okay. I'll keep trying. So sorry. How about now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry. Let me get the right screen. You guys did a good job practicing with me, but all right. Am I on?
Yay. Great.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. So again, my name is Mart Larson. I'm from the New York City Parks Department, and I am going to present the work of our natural resources group over the last decades, looking at salt marsh restoration. And I'm going to speak for the ecologists that have been working really intensely on this work in the last decade. My virtual co-presenter, Rebecca Swiatek, and many others. And I'm going to set the stage. You might have heard before for New York City to provide that context of not just an urban metropolis with a large percentage of impervious area, but the context of New York City as a place with a significant amount of natural area within the land cover being about 12% natural if you look at the forests and the wetlands and grasslands in our natural systems. And of course, with a focus on salt marshes for this talk, it's been said before, and it's always worth emphasizing just how much we've lost, and that we're really focusing on protection of the some 10 to 15% of historic salt marsh left, and even less freshwater wetland. So the Parks Department is a big player in that effort to protect the marshes and the rest of the wetland systems that we have. We protect and manage about half of the salt marsh area across New York. It's over 1,500 acres. And the other wetland systems, sort of summarized here, freshwater wetlands and streams and the adjacent shrub forests are all really critical elements to help be effective in that protection, much the way Terry Doss mentioned, the whole ecosystems that we need to focus on for that work. So I'm going to give a bit of a story as I see it of the salt marsh restoration kind of arc in New York City, beginning with what was really driven by a reactive response to horrible events, to the big spills along the Arthur Kill, and you're going to hear more about that from Carl Alderson. But it was really that that restoration action that began with a remediation need on a very urgent basis, but provided the impetus by necessity to learn about the restoration protocols that we still use today. So whether it's from native seed collection across various marsh types to plant propagation, and it was really vegetative propagation that was important in the spill response. Moving on from the 90s to today, mitigation driven by regulatory requirements has been a key driver for taking the restoration actions that were necessitated by large infrastructure projects, but and that occupied some really significant areas, but were critical for us to help understand what it is that we can do and we can do well. A lot of these mitigation projects involved removing fill, removing sometimes relatively thin layers of recent fill that allowed us to restore hydrology. So again, it was that sort of fundamental principle of restoring the hydrology first, setting that grade correctly, and then adding the vegetation, whether that was in plugs, which is what we primarily did, and sometimes seeding. These images are from a number of past restoration projects, and I'll keep going. The habitat restoration, as opposed to being mitigating for an impact, is a big source of funding, of course, not until, however, the 1990s and hopefully more present. So with the first big habitat restoration funding coming from places like the New York State Bond Act, and happily, we hopefully will experience that in surging funding today. Again, many of the same restoration techniques were used in these projects, which involved oftentimes fill removal. But what was significant, I think, about having restoration funding specifically separate from mitigation funding is that we could trial new approaches in areas, for example, inset on about the Bronx River, that wouldn't necessarily have been pursued if these were mitigation projects, and we learned a fair amount from these. Today, I'd say that when we look at restoration, it kind of goes without saying, but I think it's a relatively new phenomena that we're focused on all of the ecosystem services that salt marshes can provide, and we've got some restoration techniques that are specifically being trialed to address specific services. So John McLaughlin is working with us in Allen Creek Park to look at the impact of design on water quality, improvement benefits of salt marshes. There's shoreline resiliency that we know about, but which really has become prominent since the post-Sandy work at Sunset Cove. That was a factor in getting funding, and then increasingly understanding the social, the health, and recreational well-being benefits of salt marshes. So looking back over the last 30-some years, this is a tally of just the restoration projects within New York City parks. So it doesn't include some of the big projects that the Salt Marsh Islands, for example, in Jamaica Bay. And this look back just on park system is of about 38 projects covering about 130 acres. And I've colored them here to just show which ones were predominantly funded through mitigation actions and versus restoration funding not predominantly associated with mitigating impacts. And on average, these projects are are less than 3 acres in size, and you can see that there's some surges where we have significant acres, larger projects being done. So some of these surges in 2011 was and some of our partners with the Army Corps, we accomplished one of our largest projects, the Ed Garretson Creek restoration. And then 2019 represents the Sawmill Mitigation Bank with EDC. So we've looked back at our success and challenges in restoring salt marshes in the past. About 5 years ago, we had an EPA Wetland Program Development Grant that let us take a really close look at how our projects were doing. And one of the motivations for that was to see if we needed to update monitoring and design guidelines. We came up with some tweaks in our past approaches that we documented in our guidelines shown here on the screen, and you can get those from the New York City Parks website. And I'm going to just give an overview of the results that we found looking at these restoration projects. We looked at 22 projects that were ranged in size from 2 to 20 acres and from approximately, and were from 2 to 20 years old across the city. And we compared those with some reference sites. Generally, the goals were similar across all projects, as I think we're talking about goals similarly in this session. We wanted to restore vegetation structure above and below ground, as well as geomorphic structure of these wetlands and function, of course, for fish and wildlife, as well as other ecosystem functions. But we focused on these. Our monitoring really focused on the structural components that were easier to measure in a year time. The restoration sites we looked at compared to the reference sites were predominantly low marsh, and I think that speaks to something Terry Doss mentioned earlier, that a lot of the mitigation projects we found are really driven by reestablishing low marsh, so we didn't have as much variation as some of the reference sites. We found that some of the reference sites with using some metrics were in significantly better condition when we looked at total vegetation cover, high marsh species cover, below ground biomass. We have found some significantly better indices. In restoration sites, we did find greater above ground biomass and taller Spartina, for example. So it wasn't entirely consistent, but it does reflect the change over time. Our restoration success is definitely characterized in terms of a sustained vegetative footprint. So we did find that the marshes that we designed, I apologize, I live in New York City, so we have a lot of ambulances for that. That the vegetation establishment and below ground biomass really increased over time with the age of the marshes. We found that design was important. So the salt marshes that did best and that had particularly more below ground biomass were designed to have contain a fringe marsh or a protective barrier. And we found that the below ground biomass might also have been impacted by whether it's planted in existing substrate or clean sand. So a lot of design parameters that we want to look at. We're continuing to monitor our current restoration projects, and in a nutshell, we're finding that our projects are meeting the vegetation and hydrologic goals. Our structural and functional goals are generally being met. That's our compliance monitoring. And we are finding that in the high marsh in particular, there are features that we want to investigate, like the condition of the sediment and how it might affect Spartina versus high marsh species, and why some species aren't catching on or doing as well as we'd expect, and we keep planting them. We have been able to verify time and time again, particularly at our reference sites, that biobenchmarking is critical. So we're finding species are growing higher in their range than the tidal elevations are showing us. So that's speaks to evidence of sea level rise. And so kind of to the last points that I want to make, we're continuing to look at our marsh conditions as driving what restoration priorities we have in the future. And so we're leaning still on an assessment that we did across all of our acreage of marshland, of salt marshland, close to a decade ago by now. But we're also looking at the results from long-term monitoring sites and are finding, for example, at our sites where we have surface erosion tables, that there's a mix of sites that seem to be keeping up with sea level rise and sites that aren't. And we know that at the low marsh sites that are actually lower than mean high water at this point, we can see that accretion is happening, but there's also continued concern about edge erosion. And so it's really those areas that we're particularly focused on. We think that the emphasis needs to be on ongoing restoration of various types, but as well as maintaining the marshland that we do have. So some of the main ways in which we look at the ongoing restoration need include protecting those marshes that have recently or in the last decades really been eroding. So we're looking at how to reconstruct marsh edges and how to protect existing marsh edges. We're looking at those are on our natural shorelines. On our really urban developed shorelines, we're still looking at opportunities to excavate, fill, and to create fringe wetlands. We're working across agencies in the city to look at opportunities to try to adapt infrastructure to provide connectivity among our marshes, and to look at opportunities for marsh migration, obviously particularly important now. And then as Patty said, you recognize this photo from National Park Service, we are looking at thin layer sediment placement. We're going to be doing our very first project in New York City Parkland, where we're placing sediment in the next couple of months. And this is one of our largest concerns, to maintain our existing marshes that are that we'd like to preserve with sea level rise. So we know we can restore marshes successfully, but it very much depends still on design, on adaptive management actions that we take during construction and establishment, and it'll depend on response to sea level rise. And we're concerned in the city in particular that there are fewer and fewer opportunities for really recreating marshes for restoring. And so our emphasis continues to be, and will increasingly to be, on how to enhance our existing marshes, whether it's adding sediment, addressing water quality and buffers or allowing marsh migration. And then finally, we're looking also at how can we fund this work, because it's expensive, it's slow, it's underfunded, and we are working with a number of partners on this call to look at whether mitigation might also play a role in enhancing marshes over time. So I thank you very much for the time to participate in this this panel with these great experts.
Thank you, Marit. Okay, last but not least, we have Carl Alderson, who's a restoration ecologist, Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Habitat Restoration Specialist, and TV star at NOAA Fisheries Restoration Center. Carl provides his technical expertise to natural resource damage cases and community grant programs nationally, and has been working in this region. I know NRD cases from oil spills in the harbor as well, prior to joining NOAA. So with that, go ahead, Carl. Take it over.
Thank you. Right, where are we? Here we are. And share. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. My name is Carl Alderson with the NOAA Restoration Center, as you heard from Lisa. Thank you, Lisa, for that lovely introduction. I'm going to be talking to you today about some select projects from 30, 20, 15, and 10 years ago, and the lessons learned from those, lessons that I have personally learned in my career. And let's just get started. All right. So before I started drafting this PowerPoint, I had to remind myself what it was that we're trying to achieve at the Harbor Estuary Program. I've been a part of HEP for probably since 1995, and we've gone through a couple of different permutations, and we have achieved much in our time in the harbor as part of the restoration work group. I had to remind myself that when it comes to long-term habitat restoration goals, that we are trying to meet the target ecosystem characteristics, or TECs, as defined in the Comprehensive Restoration Plan for the Hudson Raritan Estuaries, one of our major goals. And in order to know that we are achieving that, of course, we have to be able to report on it. And so I asked myself a second question: how are we doing on that end? How are we demonstrating the progress towards achieving these TEC target ecosystem characteristics, like wetlands and hydrologic reconnection and shellfish restoration and so forth? So we do it largely with implementation monitoring. That's the basic monitoring that says, I asked the contractor to build this, and he built that, and he built it. Right. Did what I designed go in the ground according to the specifications? But unfortunately, these are fairly unevenly reported across all projects in the harbor. Secondly, we do it through functional monitoring. And that would be, not only did we build it and put it in the ground as spec'd, but how did it work? Did it improve water quality? Did it, increase habitat for fish and wildlife? In what ways? Unfortunately, what we've learned is that these reports too are fairly uneven and sparsely available. Monitoring reports, scientific papers, they just don't happen with every project. And so, that brings me to, lessons learned from 30 years of constructed results, right? We have these lessons learned, we've reported on these lessons, and oftentimes in conferences like today, and they are fantastic. They're largely observational, sometimes, somewhat anecdotal. And the problem maybe is that they're scattered amongst 1,000 PowerPoints. How do we retrieve them? How do we collect these and make them a part of our history? To that, I asked myself, how do we pass this valuable information on to future practitioners? And I think the answer is, in the absence of these others, or the sparsity or scarcity of these others, we do it with stories. And more, I'm realizing that, yeah, stories are important. I always felt as though, my monitoring results were probably the most important things. Let me get it out, let me publish it, let me put it out in some form that can be retrieved in written form, but stories matter. And so for the next 4 projects that I'll highlight, I will tell you a little bit about the implementation and the functions and the lessons learned, but also, what is the story here, and how can we invigorate these projects? How can we communicate them in a way that grabs your attention? So let's go back 30 years, shall we? Here's a motley crew of restoration practitioners. My team, the Salt Marsh Restoration team, which was put together expressly to deal with the impacts of the Exxon Bayway oil spill in 1990. We received the funding in late 91, and we began our efforts on the ground in 1992. Not sure, but we believe that the 1992 project at Sawmill Marsh, which restored a fringe of oil impacted habitat, was, if not the first New York City salt marsh restoration, preceded pretty much by Meadowlands projects that Terry talked about in New Jersey, but first in New York, and possibly the first time anyone had attempted to recover tidal marsh vegetation for oil impacts. This project satisfied the wetland tech. The text didn't exist back then, but it certainly did satisfy it. It was the methodology, oil spill recovery. It required no excavation, no filling, no carting. It was funded through a natural resource damage settlement with Exxon. It was pre-oil spill, the pre-oil spill, Oil Pollution Act, rather, of 1990, which came about largely because of the many oil spills that were occurring in the 1980s into the 1990s. There were several in 1990 in New York Harbor. And aside from the funding source, if you're looking for information about the project, we went as far as writing a peer-reviewed paper. There were newspaper articles, magazine articles, there were radio stories. It was a pretty big deal, and probably because no one had ever heard of doing something like this before. So from our monitoring efforts, which were well, cataloged, because we thought this is a project that rises to the level of, pure science and not just monitoring. We have a lot of information, and we looked at, controlling factors for success that could potentially impact the project beyond just, will we be able to put grasses back into a heavily impacted oiled site, which no one really knew could be done, right? There was high levels of petroleum hydrocarbons still in the surface of the marsh, and not just from this one spill, but from decades of spills. So we did learn the main lesson that tidal marsh restoration in oil impacted wetlands can successfully revegetate denuded wetlands and catalyze the remediation of oil soaked surfaces, sediments to depths of about 10 centimeters. Of course, the oil was much deeper than that, but we had great success in catalyzing the production of naturally occurring bacteria, which in the presence of the root zone, because they're, heterotrophic and aerobic bacteria, in the presence of the root zone, were able to gain oxygen for respiration and consume massive amounts of oil in the surface. It's fantastic. But these other effects really, could mar the results, because how would you know necessarily whether or not your restoration and your monitoring parameters, such as, height, density, above and below biomass, were controlled by oil or by other things. So now keep in mind, there wasn't a lot of information about this back there 30 years ago. So what we had to do is learn quickly. And the controlling factors seem to have been, after all was said and done, was herbivory by geese, the elevation that we were restoring to, the slope of the existing soils, of the existing shoreline, the sediment type, whether there was remnant peat or a subsurface subsediment that was, in this case, very heavily clay from the underlying bedrock parent material, or an existing peat, which was actually quite good for accepting the plant material. Of course, that was eroding away quite rapidly from the oil impacts. Wave action by by vessels, tugboats, major shipping, large oil tankers and such. And of course, current energy as well, up and down the Arthur Kill. And then ultimately, and not learned immediately, something that we could never have predicted, were the future untold impacts, which we learned some 10, 15 years after. Now, we monitored this site from, say, let's say the Old Place Creek site. There were like 5 different sites there. Sawmill, Proyles Island, Gulfport Reach. All these sites were monitored. There are probably today still PVC pipes with metal plug caps on the top of them, marking our series of monitoring quadrats. Some still there, some not. But each one of these did turn out to be a factor on this list, more so than even the oil. No matter what total petroleum hydrocarbon content we encountered, grasses were growing. They were growing, I think, largely because 2 to 3, 4 years later, after having the oil spill occur, we realized that these sediments, these hydrocarbons, were weathering heavily, so which allowed us to go in there, because the highly toxic fractional components like benzene and naphthalene were they were volatilizing into the atmosphere. So fantastic. We kind of saved the day. It worked very well, by the way. But how do you tell that story years from now? There's a very dry paper, and there are some interesting old newspaper articles, but here's a sentence. If I were writing my book, right, I would say that, this might be a sentence I might write in my story, right? Assigning ecological damages against a major polluter was a significant advancement at the time. There were very few believers in this process, and even fewer who thought this restoration work possible. It was a gigantic step forward. That's a line in a story that could be told. I often say, I should tell that story, but I'm so busy with work and doing more projects, I don't tell that story, at least not yet, maybe retirement. Okay, so moving on. 20 years ago, we decided to take a series of dikes out in order to restore flow to some 10 acres of marsh. All we had to do was take out 2 acres of a earthen dike and restore the hydrology that required that we restore hydrologic reconnection and wetlands. So the 2 texts that we were working in, it was more NRD money, and as far as the sources of information, internal data sets, never published. But we did already solve for a lot of controlling factors. The ones I have struck out are the ones that from the previous project we had solved for. And so that kind of left us with less things that we didn't know. One was construction access. Nobody wanted us to get in here, and it was very difficult. One, we had just recently procured the site for the New York City Parks Department, and access was limited to a couple of industrial sites and railroad tracks. One of the interesting things that happened during the course of this project was that in this quote below, which is my sentence from my story, the locks and door handles of the office were broken and the paper backups of pre-restoration data sets and computer files were gone. We were in new territory. To this day, we never figured out who broke into our office to try to get this data that we were collecting pre-restoration, and we never will, but we have our suspicions. And that's a kind of a story that you can't tell with monitoring, but you can with stories. So I've got probably not much time left, so I'll run through real quick. 15 years ago, we undertook a massive project at the Woodbridge Creek with the Army Corps, DEP, and NOAA. And it was a 67-acre site, largest project I've ever been involved in back in 2007. Now, again, here are the texts, the funding sources, again, NRD, but also now incorporating mitigation funds for navigational deepening through the Corps and the Port Authority. And there is a wonderful data set, a 2-year monitoring report post-restoration that NOAA published, performed by HDR, our colleagues there, including Dave Yazzo, put that report together for us. You can see the things I've deleted there. We'd already figured out how to do elevation, hydrology. We figured out how to do herbivory. But we hadn't figured out salinity. This site is 3 miles up the Woodbridge Creek, which means it's greatly influenced by freshwater inputs. The salinity ranged on the outgoing tide from 0 to the incoming tide about 15 to 20 at times. So it was, it was a brackish area. And unfortunately, when you're working in an area that doesn't have salinity up and around 20 parts per thousand, you might just be reinvaded by Phragmites, which is what happened. Now, here we are having a good time during the excavation, but here's a story down below. While performing the excavation work in the wetland, we discovered an illegal sanitary outfall from the nearby restroom attached to the Pop Warner football field snack shack. Its discovery threatened to capsize the project for weeks or even months and tank the revenue generated from the homecoming game scheduled 4 days ahead. My God. Now there's a cliffhanger for you. So you see what I'm saying here, right? We may or may not generate information through monitoring, and it's scattershot. And our lessons learned might get lost in a million PowerPoints, but I think we can capture the imagination when we tell the specific stories of the adversities that we encountered when we do these projects. Last 15 years, I'm sorry. That's a picture of Woodbridge after it was completed. Doesn't it look great? Go there today. Half of it's Phragmites. That's what I'm talking about. That's a lessons learned, a hard one about salinity and invasive plant species, but still providing amazing essential services even now. Last one.
Hey, Carl, I
Yep.
think that was your last one, Carl.
All right. Well,
Although
just look.
although I do love this project that you're about to talk about.
Well, just
but-
look at the pretty picture.
Think about it. Yeah.
All right. I am done. We haven't done much in the last 10 years. Why? You can ask me later. I'm talking about what NOAA has contributed. Unfortunately, funding sources and a lot of competition from lots of other kinds of restoration have occurred, but stories matter, tell them. And when they're good, they convey a lot of information to the young people out there who are coming up behind us. Hey, if we have had success, let's tell them. Success breeds success. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Carl. Thanks to all of our speakers, and I'm going to turn it over to Judith Weiss, who's going to moderate the Q&A session.
Okay, we have only about half as much time as we planned for our Q&A, which is unfortunate. But I have to say that the description of this session started out by saying about 20 years ago, we learned that while a restored marsh may look superficially like a natural marsh, its ecosystem services are not equivalent, and its biodiversity is generally not equivalent for about 2 decades. And I was hoping to hear more about that in terms of these marshes, but it appears that there's been very little monitoring for ecosystem services or overall biodiversity in our marshes that have been restored. It's apparent that the kind of work that's happened is just looking to see if the vegetation that you planted is still there.
I would, Judy, I would push back on that. We've looked at benthic and fish. We've had a 30-year study going, looking at specifically those things, as well as other wildlife.
And I also would chime in on that too. I think that one of the difficulties is also that long-term monitoring dollars. Many of our projects only have about a 5-year lifespan.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, at the Big Egg Marsh, for example, we did go back last summer in 2021. Well, I guess now it's 2 summers ago. We don't have that data all worked up, but went back and repeated the same monitoring that was done from 2003 to 2008 and hope to have that out as a report. But that's pretty uncommon. And Terry is in an enviable position where there's a mandate and a purpose to do that. But I think that's one of the difficulties, is getting those long term. And I also think that I know at least in Jamaica Bay, the marsh restoration approach has been the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. It's about getting the elevation and getting the vegetation there with the expectation that those functions come. But you're right, the monitoring and the science to document that and to demonstrate that isn't as robust as it could be.
The funding just hasn't been there apparently to do that. But something else is an article. I don't know if you can see this. This is in the current issue of Bioscience. I don't know if everybody can see this. It's called Greater Consideration of Animals Will Enhance Coastal Restoration Outcomes. It's the current issue of Bioscience. And the idea is, don't just say if we build it, they will come. Let's put them there. And ribbed mussels in particular are recommended for salt marshes, so that, when you replace the vegetation, stick a bunch of ribbed mussels there to seed the way you put new plants to seed more plants. Do it with the ribbed mussels too. And they find studies showing that there will be much better plant growth if you've put ribbed mussels. Let me turn.
I think that is happening. If you saw in the transplants that we did with the hummock transplants, the mussels got transplanted on that. I also believe that Chester Zarnak is doing some research looking at using rib mussels in restoration as well.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't think it's an ignore. I think that probably each of us could have spoken more to some of the biodiversity and the wildlife aspects. It was just tough to try to find big themes to bring into a 15-minute presentation.
agreed, absolutely. Let me
Well,
say a
okay.
couple of other questions. What is the life expectancy of a tidal, would you expect, would be the life expectancy of a tidal marsh project today versus what we thought 10 or 20 or 30 years ago?
I want to answer that question. It's a daily consideration for NOAA. You know, we are the tides and currents people, and we are the sea level rise people. We're the people who generate that wonderful report for the president every couple of years about sea level rise and climate change. And so it is, if I can cite examples from natural resource damage projects that we're planning, I would say that the general consensus is 30 years, maybe 50 at tops, when you consider the low, mid, and high level sea level rise projections. You can build for, I think you can build successfully for the low projection and get 30 to maybe even 50 years out of it, but all bets are off on the mid and high level projections.
And then that leads into another question, which is how—
Judy, can I just answer, add a few, and I'd love to hear from the others too. I think I agree with Carl that that's one of our major considerations. And I think we expect there also to be quite a bit of variation along, we have New York City has 520 miles of shoreline, and not all of that is salt marsh, obviously, but in the subset of that shoreline, that's salt marsh, and it's various geomorphic patterns. There's going to be different different levels of accretion, basically. And I think that we've seen that our long-term monitoring sites show quite a bit of variation. So there might be some hope in some of the, our tributaries and in some of our locations, especially if you add the consideration that we might be trying to, augment with restoration actions. And I'd also just say that that's one of the reasons that we also are looking at where migration could also happen if there is sufficient, accretion as well. So those things coupled, I just say it depends, and it's definitely going to be a challenge to see where that happens.
I agree with Mart. I think it does depend. We have sites that are already 40 years old, and we're seeing some odd things at some of these sites, like where we expect salinity to be rising, they're actually becoming fresher. At one particular site, a 200-acre site. At another site where we have our last salt marsh sparrow habitat, most places in New Jersey that are losing salt marsh sparrow habitat are losing it to sea level rise. We're losing it to Phragmites, which is the opposite of what you would expect under sea level rise. So there's a lot. Every site is different. I don't think we can ever say anything across the board. And I think that's the problem with a lot of these, especially the older mitigation sites. Everyone thought you could just go in and that we understood tidal marshes and we could go in and manipulate. But I think every site is site specific, and that's why time is needed to really understand the site going forward. So I'm a little bit more optimistic than Carl.
Yeah, and I think that part of that it goes building off what Terry said, understanding your site, understanding your hydrology there, and getting the highest elevation that you can in your construction phase to give you the most elevation capital. But also to echo on what Mart was saying is, I think what I heard you say at least is, and what Terry said earlier in her presentation, restoration isn't necessarily one and done. We may be needing to go back and augment sediment levels and do some adaptive management over time if we want these sites to be successful in the long term, given sea level rise and other challenges.
So that leads into another question that's very closely related to what we're talking about right now. Just how should our strategies change, if at all, in response to sea level rise? And have you changed them?
Well, we've absolutely changed our focus in the Meadowlands, and we're really looking, because the ecosystem has changed, the chemistry, the hydrology. We're not looking we're looking to create more sandy coastal habitat, and we think that that goes beyond just the wetlands. We're looking at uplands too, and creating more of a connected system that can then migrate. So I always like to say to people, just imagine driving up the New Jersey Turnpike and you're surrounded by sand dunes. So I'll leave it with that.
So are you making any progress in planning to put sand up there?
I'm talking a lot about it.
Okay, that's a start, I guess.
And we have a couple floating habitats that have sand, and we have cameras out monitoring the use of those sites.
Sounds good.
Big tips.
Yeah, another question for you, actually, regarding upland habitat. How are you doing with restoring upland habitat, and is there opportunity for woodlands to be in the Meadowlands?
Most of the upland landfills that we're looking at coastal grassland, because one, the regulations of landfill management over time. So the focus for those are coastal grassland, and looking specifically at habitat for species like grasshopper sparrow and savanna sparrow. We're also looking at small water features, small ponds. We have a couple landfills that have ponds on them, and again, we have remote cameras monitoring the use. In terms of woodland, that is one of the most rare habitats and one of the most threatened habitats. I showed a picture of Lowson Sloat. We would love to create more areas of woodland, and we're looking for opportunities. We have a few, but it's tough in the Meadowlands. And when you look at the history of the vegetation, it wasn't, especially in the southern part of the Meadowlands, it wasn't a forested system, but there were, our Atlantic white cedar areas as well as others. So hopefully we will have some more soon.
Could there be some lessons learned for what they did in Staten Island, where they created Great Kills Park from what had been the hugest garbage dump in the world?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm sure there's lots of lessons in the numerous landfill restorations, also of different ages. That's a whole other very rich topic, and we should definitely consider adding that to one of the HEP sessions. I want to just mention that the restoration report that I think Isabel is going to be talking about next tomorrow, I think in another session, kind of speaks to different types of ecosystem restoration categories. And we, interestingly, have a lot of restoration, upland and forest and woodland restoration work that we report on in New York City, even though we're more constrained, landlocked site, you'd think. So I think that that nexus between what the buffer area around the salt marshes that we're talking about is really key. And we're one of the things we're looking at and studying with an EPA grant is that transitional area, particularly those habitats that in the next 40, 50 years might become stressed due to salt marsh, or not. I think that there have been some studies showing some pretty surprising results in Connecticut, for example.
Okay, we're almost out of time, but one final question. Do you think that the regulations that DEC requires are inadequate, since they really do not require and in terms of monitoring? Do you think if they would expand to require more in-depth monitoring, including animals, overall biodiversity, Would that help?
I've got an answer for that, at least from the federal viewpoint. The thing about monitoring is that from federal funds, they have an expiration date. Typical congressional funding only lasts 2 years. Okay, but biological systems go on and on. So there's a disconnect between the congressional budget and what we can do with it and long-term monitoring. So even if the DEC did require additional years of monitoring and types of monitoring, federal funding would expire after 2 years. And how would we fund it? And how would the DEC enforce it? So, and federal funding, frankly, is one of the major funding sources and has been in the Harbor Estuary for 30 years.
I just wanted to clarify for core projects in the civil works, we tend to have funding set aside for 5 years of monitoring and adaptive management. But the Water Resource Development Act 2014, I believe it was, said that we need to show success, like after 10, we can fund up to 10 years if planned accordingly before we turn over that project to our sponsors for long-term maintenance.
Yeah,
I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, that points the difference between, say, grant funding and the way CORE operates, which is, yeah, they're very different ways.
Yeah.
Good point, Lisa. Thank you.
Okay, guys, I think we're gonna have to close now or in a minute. I would just like to thank the panelists for their wonderful talks. I also encourage the audience to check out the video that's been attached to this session. It's a short talk I gave about the Hope Spot. It's not directly related to the topic that we've been discussing, but it's there and available to be looked at whenever you'd like to. And I would also mention that in a half hour, the next session in the HEP conference will be about urban shorelines at 3 o'clock. So thank you all for your talks. Thank the audience for their questions. And I guess we'll see some of you at 3 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.